Now this is one of the most simple flies to tie and uses a very small amount of materials. Just some fine black thread, silver wire, a curved hook like these barbless emergers from Risen, which I'll actually be tying in size 14 for you, so you'll be able to see what I'm doing better. However, I commonly tie these down to size 24, and hooks like these Firehole Outdoors, and even smaller like these size 30 when trout are really picky, which I'll actually tie for you in this size later in this video. And you also need a really fine type dubbing like this Fine and Dry in black. Start by placing your hook securely in your vise. Then start your thread with an eye-length space behind the eye of the hook and make a couple wraps back to the hook point. Now with your wire on a bobbin holder, attach the wire on the side of the hook with 2 wraps, and then pull the wire through the thread to get it to the right length, starting out to where you started your thread. Now if you pull too much, just start over again, trying to get it right on the side of the hook and starting where you started your thread. Now make tight touching wraps back up towards the eye, securing the wire tightly. Now go back down the hook quite a ways down the bend, with touching wraps covering the wire and hook shank. Also make sure the wire has no sharp bends to it, and that it evenly stays on the side of the hook. When happy with the abdomen length, then twist your thread counterclockwise to uncord it and make the thread flat, that is if your thread can do that. Then wrap back up the hook shank with touching wraps, trying to make the abdomen as smooth as possible. Now, if you have a rotary vise, this is much quicker, but you can wrap the wire around without it. Basically, try to make the wrapping as even as possible up the hook shank. Once you reach where you started your thread, then you're done wrapping the wire. Now, if you use the rotary, you wrapped a few wraps of thread onto the head. So unwrap it and then capture the wire with 3 to 4 tight wraps. Now to really secure the wire tightly, pull it rearward and wrap over it going the other direction a few times as well. Now you can helicopter the wire off clean. And don't worry that the head looks really messy right now. We'll fix it with the dubbing ball. For a larger fly like this one, you can add a fair amount of dubbing, but obviously you want to use much less with a smaller fly. Dub on a rather thin noodle and make a dubbing ball right behind the eye of the hook. As you can see, there are red and chartreuse fibers with this black dubbing. Fine and Dry adds these, and they are UV reactive, so it really helps make this fly more attractive to trout. Once you make the dubbing ball, then bring your thread forward right behind the eye and stroke all the fibers rearward and make one last wrap behind the eye. Now it's difficult to get head cement on this fly without soaking the dubbing ball with it, so I paint a little onto my thread and whip finish that into the fly. And there we go, a black beauty. And if you were thinking this sure looks like a zebra midge, then you'd be right. Basically, it is a zebra midge without the bead head. The nice thing about this fly is that it's simple enough to be tied on the smallest of sizes. Here I'm going to demonstrate tying it on a size 30 hook, which is the smallest hook I own. Now there's a few differences to this, and for one, brassy sized wire is thicker than the wire gauge of the hook, so I'm going to use an extra small ultra wire. And I will also be using a finer thread, here the Vivus 16-aught. Now be careful taking the hooks out of the package. They're like grains of sand and can be lost in your carpet if you drop one. Somehow, some way, get the hook secured in your vise. And I have seen people use hackle pliers for this. Then we're going to tie it in the same way as a size 14. However, we will change one thing. When attaching the wire, don't go back up towards the eye while securing it. Adding extra taper is not needed on such a small fly. Now I am sorry, but I had to crop in so tight where the fly could not stay in the shot while I was rotating the vise. And I couldn't seem to film this as well as my other flies, but it is what it is when you're tying so small. One other thing that is different is the amount of dubbing. With something so small, you really want almost nothing. In fact, right here is too much. Here we go, that's perfect. Oh, and don't whip finish the cement into the fly, but after painting it on, just wrap it onto the head and then whip finish over that. Believe me, it's much easier that way. If you whip finish over the eye, just use your fingernails to pinch the whip finish and it should set back behind the eye. Well, there we go, a midge pupa that is no larger than a grain of sand. Seriously, super small. You might be asking, why fish something that small? Well, there are some fisheries where the midge pupas are very tiny, and the fish are really picky on the size of fly. The San Juan comes to mind, and many other western tailwaters are the same way. The smaller the fly, the more strikes you will get. Of course, at that point it's tough to bring in the larger fish if you get one hooked, so it's a give and take. But there are days where having a fly this small could make or break your day. Anyway, go check out Risen Fly. They have some really high quality hooks, like the ones I was using today, at a great price. Also, they have great quality rods, reels, and other gear as well. And use my discount code for additional discount at checkout. It's McFly. Easy enough to remember, right? Well, here are the two flies I tied today. Sure is a vast difference between the sizes, right? And it is amazing how the size 14 looks huge against the size 30. For a hook, we will need a 2x long shank nymph hook like these Risen 5262s, and today I'm tying a size 14. We will also need a gold bead. For this size hook, a 2.8mm bead will work great. The best way to put the bead on the hook is to place the bead in your hand and bring the hook point to it. Place the hook and bead securely in your vise. Now for added weight, and to build a bit of a taper, let's put some .010 size lead wire on a bobbin holder and make about 10 or so wraps of the lead onto the hook. And I like adding a drop of super glue here before pushing the wire up into the bead cavity. For thread, I like this Viva 6/0 in brown. Start your thread right behind the lead wraps and break or snip off the waist. Then come up through the lead wire and back down, stopping just in front of the hook bend. For a tail, and also the body of this fly, we will need a hare's mask. Clip off a small section of fur near the forehead of the mask where the hair is a bit darker. Then pitch the tips to get just the guard hairs and pull out the underfur. Now save this underfur for later on the fly. Now measure out the tail to about 1/2 or 3/4 the length of the hook shank. Then tie it in with a couple tight wraps down to the bend of the hook. I like to make one wrap under the tail also to keep it aligning straight. Then tie up to just before the lead wraps and trim off the waist. Clean up that section with a few more wraps and then come down about halfway between the lead and the tail. Now we need some gold tinsel. Trim off a few wraps of the tinsel, which should tie 4 to 5 of these flies. Now the tinsel I have is gold on one side and silver on the other. To get the gold side to show when wrapping the rib, tie it in so the silver side is on the outside. Wrap this down to the start of the tail. Now back to that underfur we saved earlier. We will use this as dubbing on the fly. Separate this into 2 sections, one with a bit more guard hairs and one to be mostly the underfur. Now some guard hairs will be in the underfur section and some underfur will be in the guard hair section, and that's okay. For the abdomen, we will use the underfur section of dubbing we made. Make a thin but tapered noodle onto your thread. Then start wrapping this up the hook shank with touching wraps, trying to cover the thread wraps. Also, as you can see, I did build a bit of a taper into my noodle, but make sure that this is wound on with an even taper like so. You can add more dubbing if you need. Anyway, end at about a 1/3 mark on the hook shank, right behind the lead wraps in this case. Start wrapping the tinsel up the hook shank with a few open spiral wraps, trying to keep the wraps as even as possible. This is going to create a bit of a rib on the fly. Once you reach your thread, then capture the tinsel and cut off the waist. For the wing case, we will use a turkey feather. Pull off a small section of about 6 fibers, and these stay together quite well. Just stroke the fibers out, and then trim or rip off the stem. Then cut off the butt ends to make it squared off. Tie the butt ends in so it's right behind the bead and directly on top of the hook. Tie this down to about the halfway mark on the hook shank. Now, I actually didn't go far enough here for my liking. Anyway, now take that dubbing section you made that has more guard hairs in it and make a loose dubbing noodle onto your thread. Now you really want this loose, so do not twist on too tight. Wind the noodle onto the thorax section of your fly, making a large and buggy looking thorax. End with your thread right behind the bead. Now pull the turkey feathers up and over the dubbing thorax and capture it with a few tight wraps. Ensure that it is flat across the top and spread out a bit. You can use your thumb to position it where you want it. Then cut off the waist close. Add a bit more of that scruffy dubbing, making a very thin noodle. Then wrap this around the thread wraps to hide them. Then whip finish your fly right behind the bead. If you pull tight enough, it should seat the thread under the bead and make it disappear under the dubbing. Then cut off the waste thread. Now, as you can see, I made this wing case a little bit too short. I usually bring it back just a bit more to about there. Now, because of all the dubbing, you won't want to use conventional head cement. This water-based head cement from Loon works great though. Dab a bit onto the whip finish, and it will seep down under the dubbing and into the whip finish. It will dry clear and won't gum up the dubbing the same way traditional head cement will. Anyway, brush out the bottom of the thorax to make the guard hairs stick out a bit more. This will act like little eggs. And you could even use a needle to pick out a few more hairs if you want them. And there we have it, a finished hare's ear fly. I always thought of these to mimic tan caddis pupa. However, they can also imitate a number of other aquatic bug species. I like tying these with a bead and some extra weight to get them down, but they can also be tied without any weight as well if you choose. Let me know in the comment section how you prefer to tie these flies and what you feel they mimic the best. To start, we will need a scud hook like these Risen 9251s, and today I'm tying in a size 16. We will also need a silver bead, and today I'm using a size 2.4mm. The easiest way to put the bead on the hook is to place the bead in your hand and bring the hook point to it. Okay, place the hook and bead securely in your vise. For thread, I really like this Vivas 10-aught in hot red. Start the thread right behind the bead and then snip or snap off the waist. Then bring the thread down deep into the bend of the hook. For a tail, we will be using a natural colored pheasant tail. Stroke out half a dozen or so fibers to align the tips, and then break or trim off the stem. Tie in a small tail, about half a hook shank length, then tie up to the bead for an even body. Then simply break the fibers off with some thread tension. For the body, we will use a large size pearl tinsel. You don't need a large piece. In fact, this size will tie about 3 to 4 of these flies. Tie this in directly on top of the hook, so it doesn't extend out past the bead. Then tie down to the start of the tail with even wraps. Start making wraps up the hook shank. To get the ribbing effect, try to wrap so the tinsel covers half of the previous wrap. This will also make the fly more durable. When you reach the bead, capture the tinsel so it's on top of the fly, and then wrap back down to about the 1/3 mark on the hook shank, or in this case, about the hook point mark. Make sure the tinsel stays directly on top. Now we need some rainbow scud dub. Select a small amount here. We really don't need too much. Then create an even and tight noodle on your thread. This should not be a very thick noodle. Keep it fairly thin. Then proceed to wrap a collar of sorts on the fly to build a thorax. You want this thorax to be round and even. And with your thread right behind the bead. It helps to twist the bead to keep it from getting stuck in a weird position. Now pull the flash up and over the thorax to create a flashy wing case. Capture it so it's even on top. Make a couple tight wraps and then pull the tinsel rearward and make a few wraps in front. Now cut it off as close as you can. Make a few more wraps to clean up that section and cover any flash or dubbing that is sticking forward. Now you want a fairly pronounced hot spot on this fly, so make sure you wrap enough to see the thread. When you're happy with the hot spot, then whip finish your fly. Brush the dubbing down with your fingers and then trim any extra long fibers. To cement this fly, I like this Solarez Ultra Thin resin. Paint a little on top of the wing case and get some along the whip finish. When you cure it with your light, it will shine the wing case up a bit more and secure the fly for multiple fish strikes. And there we have it, the Rainbow Warrior. This is a great attractor pattern in waters where the fish like smaller flies. It's flashy and will get the fish's attention. If you have fished this before, let me know how it worked for you in the comments section. Or if you haven't heard of it, let me know what you all think. The creator of this pattern is Lance Egan, and I'll tell you, I think he makes a great pattern here, along with some other wonderful patterns he has designed. To start, we will need a jig hook and slotted tungsten bead. Today I'm using Risen's Barbless 9230 in size 12, and their gold 3.0mm size bead. The easiest way to get the bead on your hook is to place the bead in your hand and bring the hook point to it. Place the hook and bead securely in your vise. Note that the bead has only one orientation where it will seat properly in the jig portion of the hook. There we go, that is correct. For thread, I'm using Vivus 10-aught in brown today. Start the thread right behind the bead and build a bit of a thread bump inside the bead slot to stabilize it. Then snip or snap off the waist. Now bring your thread down to about the hook point mark. Traditionally, CDL feathers are used for the tail. These Whiting CDL tailing packs have enough feathers to make thousands of these flies. Align the tips of about 6 to 12 fibers and then rip them off of the stem, keeping the tips aligned. Measure out about a hook shank length tail and then transfer that measurement to your other hand and make a few tight wraps to hold them down. Ensure that the feathers are tied in directly on top of the hook shank. Now don't go all the way down to the bend just yet. Stop in between the hook point mark and the bend of the hook. For this fly, I'm going to make a hot spot with some gold holographic tinsel. Tie this tinsel end down to the bend of the hook. Note that my thread is flat here. I actually spun it counterclockwise to flatten it and make the thread wraps more smooth. Anyway, once tied in, bring your thread back up to about a quarter of the hook shank length. Now start making even wraps up the shank with your tinsel. Once you reach the thread, then capture the tinsel and snip off the waist. For the abdomen, and to get some ribbing effect, you could use a wide variety of materials. Today though, I'm using a synthetic quill. They are easy to work with and have a sticky back to them. Tie the quill in right in front of the tinsel tie-off. Now it's a good time to trim off any excess materials. Here you can see I'm spinning my bobbin counterclockwise to uncord the thread again and flatten it. This will help with making a smooth underbody for more even wraps with the quill. Bring your thread up to the bead and then snip off the feathers right behind the bead so the body is even. Then come back down the body with some flat wraps and then back up to build a bit of a taper. Now you can do this as many times as you want to build an underbody to whatever shape you're looking for. Here I want to show you me spinning the bobbin to flatten the thread. I do this every once in a while to keep that thread flat. Okay, now that I'm happy with the underbody, I will start making touching wraps up the hook shank with this synthetic quill. Now, if you want wider segments, you could space this out a bit, which I did slightly. It's up to you though. By the way, this won't look like much yet. The body will really shine up once we add the UV resin. You will see. Anyway, when you reach the bead, then capture the quill and cut off the waist. Clean up that section with some thread wraps and build a bit of a collar on the fly. Then whip finish your fly. Now we need to make the wing case. I like using two products for this. The Solarez Thin and Solarez Color in black. Place one drop of the thin on the back of the hook right against the bead like so. And then turn the fly upside down so it doesn't drip and keeps its shape as a bump on the back there. Then cure the resin hard. Now we will need a little bit of the black. I like getting some of it on the tip of a bodkin rather than using the brush for this application. Paint the black resin over the bump you made and then cure it hard. This will make a nice looking wing case. Now to finish off the fly, I will be using the Solarez Ultra Thin. The paintbrush applicator makes this step easy. Paint some over the whole body, ensuring that it doesn't build up at one spot or drip. Just a light coating is all you need, trying to brush the majority of it forward towards the hook eye to help keep the taper. Cure this with your UV light and your fly is now finished. Perdigons are a very simple and effective style of fly that is very versatile. It's not really a name for one specific pattern, but a style more or less. You can tie these in a wide variety of colors like I'm showing here. All you really need is pick the color of the underbody. You need a rib material, which could include wire, different color thread, flash, natural or synthetic quill, and much more. You will also need a type of tail, or decide if you even want one at all. And then of course what color bead and the size of hook. These can mimic a wide variety of different bug species depending on what colors and sizes you make. Now I believe they were originally created by the Euro Nymph competitors in Europe because they get down quick and don't snag the bottom as easily as non-jigged flies. However, these really can be fished in many different techniques, not just Euro nymphing, so give them a try. Let me know in the comments section what your experience is with the Perdigon, and also what colors and materials you use to create your favorite version. So last week I tied the patch rubber legs in the original way of tying it, but today we will try a new technique. And like I said last week, you can use a nymph hook, but I like using something a little stronger like these Streamer 300s from Risen Fly. and today I'm tying a size 10. Place a hook securely in your vise. We will want to add some weight, and you can use some lead-free wire if your local rivers don't allow lead. However, I find that lead is needed to flatten the bug, which you will see me do later in the video. Make 10 to 20 wraps with the lead wire. Here I'm making 15. Bring the lead together into a tight coil, and then position it so it's slightly forward. For thread, I really like this Vivus 6/0, and today I'm using brown. Start your thread behind the hook eye, and then come down over the lead while still holding onto the tag end to help assist with jumping over the lead bump. Cut or snap off the waist. Now build a bit of a thread dam behind the lead so it won't move down. Then make loose wraps over the lead and make another thread dam in front of it so you lock it in tight. Now wrap up and down over the lead to cover it with the thread, and with your thread right behind the hook eye. Now we need some of these legs. It's called bug legs from Fly Tyer's Dungeon, but it's basically the same thing as Spanflex. Trim off 2 pieces. Now this comes in a wide variety of colors, so get creative. Fold one piece in half and then tie it in so the loop extends out the front of the hook a little shy of a hook shank length. Then tie it down the hook with the bug legs on top of the hook shank. Bring your thread up to behind the hook eye. So up until now we have done exactly the same thing as last week's fly. However, we will deviate a bit from that and use another technique in tying the legs. Let's go ahead and whip finish and cut off the thread. Cut off the excess so it's a little shy of a hook shank length. Grab the other piece of legs, pinch between your fingers, and then wrap around the hook shank. Then pinch again with your fingers, and then wrap a bit up from the last wrap. Pinch again with your fingers, and then finally wrap once more around the hook, and finally pinch it all together between your fingers. Grab some Solarez thin formula. Actually, you probably want to have the cap off and ready to go before the last step, but make sure your resin and light are within reach. Place a drop of resin over the legs and ensure that each leg stay put. If they move like mine did here, then use a bodkin to move the legs into position before curing the resin. Now take your scissors and cut the loops to create 3 even legs. I find that it helps with the next steps to cut the legs a bit shorter and roughly to the desired final length here. Now start your thread again behind the eye of the hook and snip off the waist. Then wrap down the hook until you reach the tail. Now we need some variegated chenille, and it comes in quite a few colors, more than I have here, but today I will be using this yellow-brown color. Cut off a piece about this long which should tie 3 to 4 of these flies. Tie this in at the rear of the fly, and then advance your thread up through the legs once again and end at the hook point. Now you could tie the chenille in before the second set of legs, but I find wrapping down and up through the legs helps really secure them, so it's up to you. Now start wrapping the chenille around the hook shank with touching wraps. Once you reach the hook eye, then capture the chenille and cut off the waist. Now make a few wraps over the chenille and pull the legs rearward to make a few wraps in front of them as well. Now whip finish the fly right behind the hook eye and under the front legs. To secure this fly, I like using Solarez ultra thin resin. Paint a little on the whip finish and then cure it with your UV light, and it will keep the whip finish secure. You can now cut the legs to your desired length. And there we have it, the finished patch rubber legs, but tied with a slightly different technique as last week's rubber legs. To be honest, I did get this technique off of the Tight Lines Productions YouTube channel, and thought it was a great way to do this. So I wanted to share with all of you. Either way you tie the patch rubber legs, it is a classic pattern that seems to work wonders. It's a stonefly representation that's simple to tie and works just about anywhere that fish eat large aquatic bugs. So let me know in the comment section what you think of this technique versus last week's. While not necessary, you can use some needle nose pliers to flatten the underwraps of lead and make the bug look a bit more natural. To start, we will need a dry fly hook, like these Risen 100s, and today I'm tying in a size 18. Place the hook securely in your vise. Now for thread, I really like this Vivus 16/0, and today I'm using black. Start your thread a hook eye length or 2 from the eye of the hook, and then make even wraps down the hook shank until you reach just shy of the bend of the hook. Do not snip off the tag end though, we will need it in a minute. For the tail, these micro fivets work great. Snip off 2 of them that have the tips aligned. Measure out the tail to about 1.5 times the hook shank length. Then make a pinch wrap and tie the tail down directly on top of the hook. Now make sure it's right on top or you will have some trouble in the next step. Tie the tail down to the bend of the hook and then bring your thread back up a wrap or 2. Now my fibbits are angled to the far right of the hook, which is going to make this difficult. I wanted to show you this though, so you know why it's important to keep them perfectly straight on top. Anyway, bring the tag thread up between the fibbits and adjust the tail so it's split how you want it. Make 2 to 3 wraps to hold the thread in place, and then snip off the tag end thread and the fibbit butts. And you can see here how the tail is now split. Now we need some dubbing. You really want a very fine dubbing. I really like this UV2 Fine and Dry, and I'm tying in black today, so let's grab a small amount of black dubbing and pull apart a bit so it's very sparse. Dub a very, very fine noodle onto your thread. I mean, we're almost touch dubbing here. Make 1 wrap under the tail to lift it up, and then start wrapping up the hook shank with touching wraps, trying to get a very even body. And there's really no need to taper it here. I actually needed a bit more dubbing. Usually you will probably need to take more off, but do either accordingly so you end up at about an eye length shy of the eye of the hook. Now we need a CDC puff. They come in a wide variety of colors, but simple white works great here. I like to wet the feather for easier tie-in. Make a pinch wrap to tie the feather tip directly in on top of the hook. Then pull the feather rearward a bit until the tips are not impeding the hook eye. Again, make sure this is directly on top of the hook, and you can rotate it a bit if you need. Anyway, tie this down with a few tight wraps, and then cut it off so it's about a half a hook shank length. Now add a little more dubbing and wrap that noodle once under the wing, and then create a small head on the fly as well. Then whip finish your fly and cut off the waist thread close. For head cement, I really like this Loon water-based cement here. Make a dab onto the whip finish, but don't worry about it getting in the eye of the hook or absorbing into the dubbing. It will dry clear, and you can simply snap the front of the hook to clear the hook eye. And there we have it, a finished RS2. I really like tying these very small. Actually, I usually tie them regularly down to size 24, and they make a great midge or tricot imitator. They're simple enough to tie rather quickly and small. However, even though they're rather simple, it can be difficult to get the hang of. So don't stress if your first couple don't turn out perfect. Just keep practicing and you will get the hang of it. Let me know in the comment section if you have fished this fly before, or what other emerging tricot or midge patterns you like to fish. To start, we will need a red anodized long shank curved hook like these Daiichi 1273s. I usually tie these in size 18 to 22, and today we will be tying a size 20. Put the hook securely in your vise. For thread, I really like this Vivus 10-aught in black. It's a flat thread, which will be beneficial for this fly. Start your thread with a hook eye gap behind the eye of the hook, and bring your thread down into the back bend of the hook, but leave a long thread tag like this. Then bring your thread back up to just behind the hook eye. Now we need some clear micro tubing. A small piece like this will tie 5 or more flies. Make a pinch wrap to tie in just the tip of the tubing. Stop your wraps a few wraps down from the head. Then we need some red Flashabou. If you can get a wider flash, it will make the next step easier, but this thin stuff works just fine as well. Cut 1 strand off the hank, and then tie it in with a couple tight wraps. Now stretch the tubing tight so it doesn't bulk up the hook shank, and then tie down into the bend of the hook like so. Then bring your thread back up to just behind the hook eye again. Make touching wraps up the hook shank with the flash, and capture it at the head and snip off the waist. To make this more durable, let's add a brush of super glue over the flash. Now we need to take the tubing and stretch it out tight. Then start making open spiral wraps up the hook shank, leaving a little gap in between the wraps. As you get further up the shank, lessen the stretch of the tubing a little so it gives a natural taper up the hook. Once you reach the head of the fly, then capture the tubing with a couple tight wraps, and then stretch the tubing tight and snip it off. Now take the thread tag end and start wrapping up the hook shank in between the gaps formed by the tubing. Once you reach the head, then capture the thread and snip off the waist. Now build up the head with a couple wraps and then whip finish your fly. To finish this fly, I like adding this Solarez ultra thin resin. Paint a little around the head of the fly and then cure it into place with a UV light. And there we have it, the finished fly. I came up with this pattern and designed it to fish the San Juan River. It's a guide style, easy to tie, red annelid pattern that is just flashy enough to get the fish's attention, but still not alert them to something is off. It has caught me more large trout on that river than any other fly I've ever used, and I'm sure it'll be great on any other western tailwaters. To start, we will need a curved shank scud hook like these 2457s from Risen Fly. Today I am tying these in size 18. Place the hook securely in your vise. Start your thread right behind the hook eye and snip or snap off the waist. Then bring your thread down a ways into the bend of the hook. Now I didn't film it, but the thread I am using is Vivis 6/0 in olive. For the tail and wing case, we will need some mallard flank. For this olive color, I like the mallard flanks dyed in wood duck gold color. Natural for black or gray WD-40s. To prepare the feather, strip off all the fuzzies at the base of the feather, then separate a dozen or so fibers. Exact number isn't really important here. Just make sure it's about this wide for this size hook. Align the tips of the fibers by stroking them straight out from the stem, and then rip them off at the stem. By the way, you could use actual wood duck flank here, but it's expensive, so dyed mallard flank works just fine. Okay, measure out the tips to about a hook gap length. Then tie this in so that length is sticking out the back of the fly. You really want to tie these deep into the bend, and this can be tricky to keep the fibers from rotating on you. Just keep stroking them straight out while tying. Now bring your thread up the hook shank all the way up to just shy of the eye of the hook. Then come down a little ways and back up a few times to create a nice tapered abdomen. End with your thread about a third of the way from the hook eye to the tail. Then pull back the mallard flank fibers and flatten them out the best that you can on top of the hook shank, and then tie these in with a couple tight wraps. Now we need some dubbing. Today I'm using microfine dry dub from Hairline in BWO olive. Pull out a small amount like so. You could really use any type of dubbing here, as long as it is a dry fly dubbing and rather fine. Dub this onto your thread and make a small dubbing ball to build the thorax of the fly. End with your thread just behind the hook eye. Now pull the mallard flank up and over the dubbing ball, trying to keep all the fibers aligned straight. It helps to smash this down a bit with your thumb to flatten out the fibers a bit. Now make a couple wraps to hold it into place. Bring your thread up to the hook eye and then back down and pull the mallard flank fibers rearward once again and tie them down like so. Then snip off the mallard flank as close as you can with some fine point scissors. Whip finish your fly and you're now done. Now to make this fly more durable, I like to use this UV resin by Solarez. It's called Ultra Thin and it's easy to apply with the brush applicator. It also soaks into the fibers quickly. Cure it with your UV light and the fly is now finished. Well, there we have it, the WD-40. Probably one of the easier nymphs to tie, and it is super effective. Great for mimicking midge pupa and emerging betas. So today we're going to be tying the perfect egg. I'm starting today with a Risen barbless emerger hook in size 16. But you can use any curved, short shank hook that is strong, like these. For thread I'm using Vivis 6/0 in pink. You can use red, or whatever color you want. Start your thread directly behind the hook eye, then snap or break off your thread. Bring your thread back to just past the hook point, and then go back up, and then back down, and back up halfway more to create a base to tie the material in securely. Now there's no relation, but I'm using McFly phone. the clown package. Pull off strands like so in each color, about this thick. Then lay them down on the other colors, trying to keep the tips aligned. Now, on a few videos across YouTube, including the very popular Tight Lines productions, you can find techniques to cut the tip off of one of these hackle pliers and use it as a tool for no-waste eggs. It's a great technique, but today I'm going to show you how to do it without this technique. However, it does leave a little waste, so keep that in mind. Grab close to the tip of the bunch and pinch tightly. Then make a twist to compress the foam at the tie-in point. Now place the foam over the hook perpendicular and make 2 tight wraps over it. Then make 2 tight wraps going the other direction as well. Tighten these wraps with one last hard pull, and then wrap back up on those wraps to further tighten them. Now you can whip finish the fly and trim off the waist. Then stroke out the fibers so they are even and make a straight cut perpendicular to the hook shank. And you really want to cut fairly close to the hook shank as well. Do so on the other side as well, keeping both sides as close to the same size. I really like Loon's water-based head cement for this. You don't really have to worry about getting any on the foam. It really does help to cement the head of these flies in order to keep them lasting a long time. Now just fluff up the foam to make it more round. And rolling around in your hand also helps to make it more round. And there we have it, the perfectly round egg. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, please subscribe. Also, check out my sponsor, Risen Fly. They sell amazing fly tying materials, including some great hooks and beads. And they also sell some really nice rods and reels as well. Offer the best prices in the business. I will see you on the next video. Now you go catch some fish.